Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the American Family Insurance DreamBank, where we believe in the transformative power of dreams. My name is Andy Frisky. I am a senior dream curator here at DreamBank, and on behalf of our entire team, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us here. So, as we get started, we always like to poll the audience. So if you could pop into the chat, what's one thing you are hoping to take away from Dr. Adrienne Keene's presentation today? Would love to hear from you all. For those of you who have attended our virtual or in-person events in the past, welcome back. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'd love to take a few moments and introduce you to DreamBank. So here at American Family Insurance, we believe that communities are stronger and the future is brighter when people are actively pursuing their dreams. And that's why DreamBank was created. It's an inspirational community destination and virtual experience that is dedicated to dreamers everywhere. Our offerings, from our daily event series to our immersive signature programs, there's always something for every dreamer. Our offerings are designed to help you celebrate the dream journey, overcome obstacles, and to stay motivated. Our mission also includes our commitment to bringing forward critical conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're honored to showcase speakers who represent the vibrant and varied dimensions of our ever-growing community of dreamers. And it is our earnest intention to offer content that leads to reflection, growth, and unity. And we thank you all for taking the time to listen and learn alongside us. So without without any further ado, would love to introduce our featured speaker here today, Dr. Adrienne Keene. So Dr. Keene of the Cherokee Nation is a scholar, writer, blogger, podcast host, and activist. She's passionate about reframing how the world sees contemporary Native cultures. She's the creator and author of Native Appropriations, a blog discussing cultural appropriation and stereotypes of Native peoples in fashion, film, music, and other forms of pop culture. She's the author of Notable Native People, 50 Indigenous Leaders, Dreamers, and Changemakers from Past and Present. And she's also the co-host with Matika Wilbur of the popular podcast, All My Relations, that explores what it means to be a Native person in contemporary America. So thank you so much for joining us here, Adrienne. We will go ahead and let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Andy. Sio Nagad, Adrienne Keene Dawado, Chichalagihi Ayeli, Gianni Gisqua, the Lonige de la Jutla Digega, Providence, Rhode Island, Janela. Hi, everyone. I'm Adrienne Keene. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I'm originally from Southern California, and I currently live in Providence, Rhode Island. I grew up on Kumeyaay homelands and currently reside on Narragansett and Wampanoag homelands in Rhode Island. So I'm so excited to be here with you today and to be able to share a little bit about the work that I do and some of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And thank you so much to DreamBank for the invitation and for all of you joining us today and taking the time out of your afternoon. So I will go ahead and share my screen. So I wanted to start today with just an acknowledgement of the state of the world and the way that things are unfolding currently in Gaza and in the Middle East. And I wanted to start with this quote from Angela Davis, because I have been thinking so much about so many of the overlaps between marginalized communities, between what is happening in Gaza, between and the histories and experiences of my own Cherokee community. And I'm also Armenian, so my Armenian relatives and ancestors as well. And she says, our histories never unfold in isolation. We cannot truly tell what we consider to be our own histories without knowing the other stories. And often we discover that those other stories are actually our own stories. So I hope in our discussion today, we can use the experiences of settler colonialism here in what's currently known as the United States and learn a little bit about the context. But I did want to acknowledge that we're all holding a lot in our bodies as we're watching what is unfolding on our phones and social media. And so bringing that into this space that hopefully we can do a little bit of learning and a little bit of healing as we move together for the next hour. So I want to start with a story. In the Cherokee community, we have a lot of different origin stories, a lot of different creation stories about how pieces of our landscape came to be, how knowledges came to be, different things. And one of the creation stories of what we think of as Elohi or Earth starts with the earth all covered in water, and all of the animals were in the sky world, and it was very crowded up there. And they kept looking down below and thinking, perhaps there is a place down there where we could have a new land to walk on. And they had heard at the bottom of this water that there was mud that they could bring forward. There was earth that they could bring forward to create a new land. So the animals, one by one, tried to swim to the bottom of these waters to get the mud to bring to the surface to create the new land. And one by one, all of the animals failed. And finally, when they were ready to give up, a tiny little voice said that they were going to try. And that little voice was Dionisi, or water bug. And water bug dove down to the bottom of the waters and was able to bring forward a tiny speck of mud that they placed on Turtle's back. And it grew out in all directions and became the land that we know as Alohi, as Turtle Island, as Earth. But then the land was a little bit too squishy and soft to walk on. So Buzzard volunteered to fan the new earth dry. And so as Buzzard was flying over the lands, he got really tired over the area that is currently known as North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, our Cherokee homelands. And his wings dipped down into the mud as he drooped from exhaustion. And those dips in the mud became the hills and valleys of our homelands in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And so this is the story about how our landscape as Cherokee people was shaped, how it was born, and how it was created, and how we came to be those lands. And every Indigenous group in what's currently known as the United States and around the world has these origin stories, has these creation stories about how we became connected to our homelands. There's an amazing book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer that if you have not read, I highly recommend as an entry point to learning about Indigenous relationality and our relationships to our more than human relatives. And she says in Braiding Sweetgrass about the Sky Woman story, which is her community's creation story. She says, children hearing the Sky Woman story from birth know in their bones the responsibility that flows between humans and the earth. The story of Sky Woman's journey is so rich and glittering, it feels to me like a deep bowl of celestial blue from which I could drink again and again. It holds our beliefs, our history, our relationships. Looking into that starry bowl, I see images swirling so fluidly that the past and the present become as one. Images of Sky Woman speak not just of where we came from, but also of how we can go forward. So these creation stories are not just kind of fairy tale fun stories to tell one another. They actually contain responsibilities. They contain knowledge of the relationships that are necessary for us to be good relatives to this land. And for Cherokee people, we also have stories of this specific site in our homelands in North Carolina, what's currently known as North Carolina, called Gadua. And Gadua was the site of a central mother town. And in this mother town, there was a mound, and on top of the mound was a council house. And within that council house held a fire, and that was the central fire of the Cherokee people. And every year at a certain time, around a ceremonial time, that fire, the fires in all of the villages surrounding would be extinguished, and people would come to that central fire to gather embers to bring back and relight the fires of their home community. And sometimes we as Cherokees talk about ourselves as people of one fire because of that. And so this site is a physical place where I can go as a Cherokee person and stand and know that this is also the site of the stories talk about our emergence as humans onto this earth comes from this place. And so it's a place that I can go that has a tangible connection, that I can feel the land, that I can stand on it and know that my ancestors have been in this place since time immemorial, that this is truly our homeland. And these photos come from my very first trip out to Gadua, to North Carolina. And it was in the early days of Instagram where we overly filtered everything. So they look a little dark and emo, but I like these photos because they're from that very first trip that was really powerful and important for me. And so in the Cherokee language, one of the ways that we can say who we are is Gadua or Anigitawagi. Gudua is that place, Gudua is that site, and the direct translation is the dirt which belongs to the creator. And then Anigituagi, one of the ways that we can say Cherokee people, is the people of Gudua. And so we are, as Cherokee people, the people of the dirt which belongs to the creator. So we have, as people, this intimate connection to the land that we come from. We literally are the people of the dirt that belongs to the creator. So we are the land that we come from, and that's what it means to be an Indigenous person. And so when colonization started for Indigenous peoples in what's currently known as the US, the goal was to sever that relationship to land, to sever that connection, to remove people, Indigenous people, from the land through force, through assimilation, through cultural genocide, through actual genocide. And so Gudua was actually destroyed in 1776 by something called the Rutherford expedition that was sent out to basically punish all of the Native communities that had sided with Britain during the Revolutionary War. So in 1776, as very important things were happening for the formation of what's currently known as the US, the mother town of the Cherokee people was being destroyed. And after that, it moved into non-Native hands and non-Native ownership. And it wasn't until the 1990s that the Eastern Band of Cherokees actually were able to get that land back and back into Cherokee hands. The mound was destroyed, and now there has been a long process of starting to build back up that mound as well. And this severing of connections to land, I want to talk a little bit about my own family's journey and those connections, because I think it's important to establish how it's not just a war, it's not just a trail of tears, all of these things. It's also policy. It's also things like boarding schools that are about severing these ties to land. So for me, for my family, my ancestors began in our homelands in what's currently known as North Carolina and Georgia. And then during what is known as the Trail of Tears, my ancestors were forcibly removed from those homelands and forced to walk to what was then known as Indian Territory, now known as Oklahoma. And on that Trail of Tears, 25% of the community members who started that trek did not make it to Indian Territory. It was a time of immense loss for our community. And then once we arrived in Indian Territory, all of the lands were held collectively by the tribal nations. But then in the 1880s was something called the Dawes Act, which was an allotment act. And the idea was to take this collectively held land and divide it up into individual land parcels where each Indigenous or each Native person would get 160 acres. And then anything that was not parceled out to the enrolled tribal members was declared excess and then open to white settlement, even though it was promised that Indian Territory was going to remain for Native people forever. That's what started the land runs, and it was actually the largest transfer of Native land into non-Native hands in the history of the United States through that act. This map is my family's allotment, is that tiny little red square in the center. That was my great-grandmother's allotment. And then in the 1940s, through something, in the 1940s, my grandmother and her siblings were sent to Chilocco Indian School, which was a federally run Indian boarding school. And these schools had the professed mission of kill the Indian and save the man. So the idea was cultural assimilation, was to remove young people from their homes, from their families, from their communities, and cut their hair, have them learn English, and not see their families for extended periods of time. So my grandmother and her siblings went through that schooling experience. And while she was away, my grandma was away at school, something called the Flood Control Act of 1941 was passed, and my family's allotment land, along with hundreds of other families, was flooded out due to a dam built by the Army Corps, a hydroelectric dam built by the Army Corps of Engineers. So that little red square is now at the bottom of Fort Gibson Lake. And as a result, my grandma decided that she would move to Los Angeles. So she bought a one-way bus ticket and moved to Los Angeles, where she met my Armenian grandpa, and they got married and were married for 67 years. So my personal story is a story of colonization, of federal policy, of assimilation tactics, of physical flooding of the land to try and sever this connection. So this is settler colonialism, this entire package. It's not just the Indian Wars of the 1800s or these sort of like past ideas that we have that colonization was something that happened a long time ago, and we're now living in the after effects. It's ongoing, it's constant, and it lives in us as Indigenous people. So think, if I am one Native person, and this is the story of my family, that every single Native person has a story like this, a story of survival, a story of resistance, of strength, because I'm still here and still able to identify as a Cherokee woman, despite all of this happening to my family, to my community, to my ancestors. So settler colonialism is all of this. This quote comes from Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, who wrote a really powerful piece called "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor." And they talk about that in order for settlers to make a place their home, they must destroy and disappear the Indigenous peoples that live there. Indigenous peoples are those who have creation stories, not colonization stories, about how we came to be in a particular place, indeed how we came to be a place. So when I tell these stories of our creation stories, of our connection to the land, those are those stories that that Tuck and Yang are talking about here. We have the stories of how we literally emerged from this place, not how we came to it as settlers, as colonizers. And I think that this definition is helpful. It also is not completely complete. And we could spend a long time talking about the ways that descendants of enslaved Africans are not settlers due to the circumstances of them being colonized people themselves, being ripped from their homelands and brought to this place against their will, being forced to work the land through enslavement and build a relationship to it in that way, or the ways that recent immigrants who come to our country that are forced to participate as settlers. There's no other option. If you come to what's currently known as the US, you are forced to participate as a settler. So what are the ways that those of us who are not Native are complicit or not complicit, or have mixed relationships to our settler colonial nation? And the settler part of settler colonization means that folks came to stay. There was no sort of extracting resources to send back to a home nation. It was the attempt to destroy what was here in order to replace it with a new nation on top of thousands of already existing Native nations. So then, if this is the history of the lands that we occupy, how then do we behave as good relatives to the land that we occupy? And that becomes kind of the central question. So I give this long intro because I want us to understand the stakes of what we're talking about. When we're talking about a land acknowledgement, which is what I hope to talk about today, what does that mean to acknowledge a land, to think about the relationships to it? It's not just this sort of checkbox where we're saying that these were lands that were once occupied by this community. You are, when you're talking about an Indigenous nation's relationship to a land, you're talking about that deep, forever, since time immemorial relationship that is very different than a sort of Western concept of land ownership, of land as a commodity, as something that you can buy and sell, things like that. So I frame all of my work through this concept that a friend called consenting to learn in public. So she had been reading my blog, which I still technically write, but haven't written on there in a long time, called Native Appropriations. And she was reading it and said, what I really appreciate is that you don't pretend like you know everything. You are really consenting to learn in public. And so when we're encountering ideas that we really don't know a lot about or are new to us, it can sometimes feel scary to enter into that space where everything feels unknown. But this philosophy means that if you're public about the fact that you are learning, if you are public about the fact that you don't know everything, that you're willing to make mistakes and to apologize and to redirect and to learn more and do better, then it really takes away a lot of that fear, because you can just say, I'm learning. And so by me offering this, I hope that if this is something that resonates with you, you can take that up and apply it to your own practice, not just of learning about Native peoples, but about any sort of cause or community that you are engaged with. And I also am going to be sharing, I think we'll be sharing it in the chat right now, a Google Doc of all of the resources that I'm going to touch on and more in thinking about land acknowledgement specifically. So in this document, there's going to be links to all of the sort of guides that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, as well as a bunch more. So if this is something you want to learn more about, this Google Doc is yours, and feel free to share it with whoever, because it's sometimes hard to absorb everything in the course of an hour. So this is where I normally in the past used to start my presentations, was with a sort of land acknowledgement of acknowledging whose Indigenous land we were gathered on, or I was sitting in, or wherever it was. And I think it is still an important thing for folks who have never really thought about this before, that everywhere in what is currently known as the United States is Indigenous land, and there are peoples who come from that land. And in most cases, there are those people still here today. And if you don't know whose land you live on, or went to college on, or went to vacation on, or whatever it is, I encourage you to find out and learn more about those people. So on the slide, there are two ways to do that. There's a number that you can text with a city and a state or a zip code, and it will text back the name of the Native Nations, or native-land.ca is where this map comes from. And they're not perfect. They're a place to start. There are always, as you can see on the map, how many territories are overlapping and are on top of each other. So it's not an infallible resource, but it is a place to start. And I also wanted to note that you'll notice I keep saying the land that is currently known as the United States, and it is a mouthful, but it is a phrase that I learned from a colleague on Twitter a very long time ago. And I think it's really important because it both acknowledges that these lands were not always known as the United States, and leaves room for the fact that there may be a future where they are not known as the United States any longer. So they are currently known as the United States, and that is what we refer to them as, but that is a current state, and it may not always be that way in the future. So the reason I have stopped sort of relying on land acknowledgements as much is because I've seen the way, just in a short period of time, they've gone from something that felt a little bit revolutionary and really important to something that feels like a checkbox and feels like it doesn't have a lot of weight behind it. So there is an Anishinaabe scholar named Hayden King who lives in what's currently known as Canada, another settler colonial nation. And he many years ago worked with his university on a land acknowledgement, and it was one of the first kind of official ones that I had come across. And then many years later, he wrote an op-ed talking about how he sort of regretted being a part of that process. And he said because it resulted in no meaningful change for the institution. And so he encouraged folks to, if you're going to do a land acknowledgement, to add the phrase on the end, and this is what that compels me to do. So thinking about moving it from just an acknowledgement to some form of action. So what does it compel you to do because you have acknowledged this land as Indigenous? How do you move yourself from just a checkbox at the beginning of an event, or in your email signature, or on a website, or whatever it is, into something that feels more actionable? And in the words of Katja Riesling-Baldi, who's a Hoopa scholar from Northern California, she said on Instagram one time, land acknowledgement is good, but land back is better. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And to kind of drive home this point, I want to show this quick little clip from a sketch comedy show in Canada. So I will show that quickly and then we'll keep going.
Hello. Oh. Hello. First, I'd like to remind everyone here to turn off your cell phones. Before we begin this evening's performance, we would like to acknowledge that this theater stands on territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Petun First Nations. We are also mindful of broken covenants and the need to make right with all our relations. And now, please enjoy the show.
Oh, sorry, hello? Sorry, excuse me, should we go?
Excuse me?
Oh, no, I just mean if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we leave?
Oh, no. The theater is here now. We'd just like to acknowledge whose land it is.
I'm sorry, I'm so confused. So if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we do something about that, or?
Hopefully we'll enjoy the performance.
Oh, okay, so some of the money from the ticket sales of the show are going to the Indigenous communities?
Well, no.
Oh, a portion of them?
No, the ticket sales go to the theater.
So is the money from the bottled water sold here going to the First Nations for clean drinking water, or?
Oh, no, that money goes to Nestle.
Nestle.
They're a sponsor.
I'm so sorry, I'm so confused. So whose land are we on? What are we doing?
It's a dialogue.
How are we making right?
Well, there's a plaque you can read in the lobby.
I don't understand.
I'm getting a message from the stage manager that we need to begin the show, so please take your seats.
But,
have a good time.
But,
Good night.
guess I'll sit down. Enjoy the show. Just enjoy the show.
So I like to show that in presentations because I think it drives home really quickly kind of the point that I am talking about in terms of the ways that that these acknowledgements can really be some sort of empty promises and mismatched goals that don't really undo the ongoing harm in institutions, by organizations, whatever it is. Because as I mentioned with the Tucking Yang piece, decolonization is not a metaphor. So it oftentimes gets taken up in ways where we say we use decolonization to stand in for social justice, to use it to make things better under the current system. And the reality is that you can't have decolonization without what Tucking Yang called the rematriation, which is a play on the word repatriation, but doing it from sort of a more feminist perspective. But decolonization is rematriation, or the return, the reestablishment of Indigenous land and life. So that brings us to the conversation around land back. So land back is kind of a movement that has emerged with that terminology in the last maybe 5-10 years or so. But the concept has existed as long as colonization has existed. But it's not just about the physical return of land to Indigenous communities. It's also about the reclamation of everything that comes with that land. So it's the knowledges that come with the land, it's the language, it's the ceremony, it's the medicines, it's the kinship, it's the relationships to that land that are a part of land back as well. So land acknowledgements can be a very important first step. And I think that I don't want to minimize the fact that the work that goes into creating a land acknowledgement is the important part. It's the part that requires real learning and unlearning by organizations, institutions, universities, all of these places. But it's only a first step if something comes after it. And that's the encouragement that I have to folks who are engaging in this process, is what comes after that land acknowledgement. What are the action steps that come with it? So one of the resources that is in that resource guide is this guide from the Native Governance Center. And they have a whole sort of self-reflection that folks can do about building a land acknowledgement for an organization or a university or whatever it is. And I won't go through each bullet point, but I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that it exists and to think about the big question of why. Like, why are you hoping to do this land acknowledgement? What is the end goal from this land acknowledgement? When will I have the biggest impact? There's a lot more sort of guides within that talk about how to do this process in a good way. And I will say that when I didn't give the context of when I first encountered land acknowledgement was in 2012, so really not that long ago. And we had a group of visiting Indigenous folks from what's currently known as Australia. And in their communities, they do something called Welcome to Country, which is an established practice among the Indigenous folks there of when you are going to another Indigenous group's territory, you say where you are from, you talk about your lands and your people, and you acknowledge that you're coming to their lands and their people's lands. And so they asked us at my university whose land we were on, and it was really kind of the first time that folks at my university had engaged in that conversation. And so at the time, it felt really powerful and important. And so the origins of this practice are Indigenous. The idea of doing a land acknowledgement is an Indigenous practice, but the way it's been taken up in the last few years is sort of pulling it away from those original origins of the land acknowledgement. But it's important in these acknowledgements to think about using appropriate language, using past, present, and future tenses, acknowledging that Indigenous folks are still here. I think sometimes I really cringe when I see past tense in land acknowledgements, and thinking them also as kind of living documents, living celebrations that are not stuck in the past, not something that is overly grim, but also does acknowledge the truth of what happened to Indigenous peoples in your territory. But I also will say that it is okay to not have a land acknowledgement, at least while you are really doing the work involved in building that land acknowledgement. So my current university did not have a land acknowledgement for a very long time. And it was not because we didn't know whose land we were on. It was because we wanted to engage in a reciprocal process with the local community to really think about what it meant to have that land acknowledgement, and to build out some action points for the university that went along with that land acknowledgement. So we do have one now, and it was one that took over a year and a half of a committee made up of local Native folks and folks on campus to come to the language and wording of the acknowledgement itself, as well as the action items for the university, which I will say they have not really acted on yet. So there's that too. As we can see, these acknowledgements can be important first steps. They can be important visual reminders when they're in emails, when they're on websites. But the more that you do the work with decolonization, and reconciliation is the term that is used a lot in what's currently known as Canada, the more you start to realize there's no reconciliation without the return of stolen land. It doesn't work otherwise. And this is Petrobaldi again. And the question then becomes like, well, how would that work? But the bigger question is, why aren't we trying? And when we move into this conversation of land back, folks get really uncomfortable. And I think the problem is the only narrative that folks have been given around this concept of another group taking coming back into relationship with the land is violent colonization. That's the only model that we have seen in these settler colonial nations. And it really represents a lack of imagination or a lack of realization by folks who have that fear that that's not what's going to happen. We're not talking about enacting the opposite of what happened to Indigenous people, to the settlers and folks who are here. We're talking about moving into a different relationship with the land. We're talking about rebuilding the knowledges, the language, the ceremonies, the relationships to that land. all while under the stewardship of Indigenous people. And that is a very different model than violent ethnic cleansing, than colonization. So we're not talking about replacing everyone. You're not going to be forced off your out of your house or whatever it is. We're talking about a return of those relationships to the land with Indigenous people at the helm of understanding what that relationship will look like. So what can we do then? People say that land back is impossible, but land back is happening, and it has been happening for a long time. And it happens in tiny parcels of a quarter acre at a time, or it happens in huge movements like 28,000 acres. And these are just like 4 random examples that I remembered off the top of my head to put in the slide, but it is happening every single day. And it's happening in very different ways as well. Sometimes it is someone who has a wealthy family, like in the case of the Colville tribe, who passed away and left the land to the tribe. Or sometimes tribes are buying back the land themselves, using their own funds to buy back that land. Sometimes it's a group effort through a land conservancy or a land trust, or there's so many different models, but it is happening, and it's happening with more frequency as we move forward. And so if this is something that is available to you, if you are someone who has generational sort of family land, or has access to, maybe you have like a second home on a lake somewhere, or something that isn't used, like there are ways to create an agreement to give that land back to the local community. So it is possible, and it is happening, and it's happening in really diverse and beautiful ways. But there are also things that we can do that are assisting in that process, that are more of a kind of day-to-day action that is more accessible to a lot of us who don't have access to land or wealth in that way. So an example is the Sogoreate Land Trust in Northern California in the Bay Area. They have something called Shumi, or land tax, that residents of the area can pay either on a monthly basis or a yearly basis as an acknowledgement that they're residing on Indigenous homelands. And that land tax is then used to purchase land, to fund programs that bring Native people back onto land and build those relationships again. They have farming projects, they have all kinds of amazing things. And so that's an actual like financial contribution that folks can make. And this exists in other places around the country as well. There's one in Seattle called Real Rent Duwamish. There are a couple of other ones I've come across. And one of the resources in the document that was shared is also how you can start one of these in your own community, if that's something that is interesting to you. The Native Governance Center also encourages folks to do a resource assessment. So if you don't have land, if you don't have a lot of access to money, that is one way you could set aside money for a recurring donation. But maybe if you don't have those, do you have time to show up to a protest, or create a voluntary land tax program, or volunteer with Native events, or whatever it is in your area? Do you have land that you want to return either now or in the future? Or if you're creating a plan on behalf of an organization, do you have tickets? Do you have admission? Do you have tuition? Do you have entry fees that you can give away to Indigenous people? And I would add waiving sort of institutional facility use fees, or cutting through red tape for reserving space, or if you're doing some big event, including Native folks in that. And these are sort of small ways that you can continue the spirit of land back, the spirit of redistributing resources to the people whose land you're on. And then there's the responsibility of bringing Native people into the spaces that you occupy, whether that is your company, your office, your school, your organization, whatever it is. How do you build meaningful relationships and have meaningful consultation with Native people in that space? how do you think about prioritizing or encouraging Native hiring, both at the senior level and at the entry level? So creating pipelines through entry level hiring, but creating institutional change through senior level hiring. And thinking really about clusters, not a single token Native person in the space. Like, how can you bring multiple people into that space? And the biggest thing is starting to ask ourselves why, rather than sort of looking at all of this and being discouraged at how hard it feels or how big it feels and saying that's impossible, why aren't we trying? Why aren't we taking some steps? Why aren't we beginning that process to get to a different endpoint? Because building relationships is everything. So as Indigenous people, relationships are at the foundation of who we are. And Indigenous relationships are not, are reciprocal. They are multi-directional. So they are about, if you are in relationship with someone, you then have a set of responsibilities towards that person and expect that that person has a similar set of responsibilities towards you. And this extends not just to human relationships, but human to more than human or non-human relatives as well, and to the land as well. So thinking about relationships at the center of this, that nothing can be done in isolation, that it has to be done in deep relationship, and that those relationships do take time to build, but we need to start the process somewhere. And now I'm going to jump in a sort of slightly abrupt way, but I want to now think about the ways that representations feed into this process of undoing the harms of settler colonialism or reinstating the harms of settler colonialism. So when we talk about Native peoples, about the concept of cultural appropriation, a lot of times people get really nervous if they haven't really engaged with Native folks that they're going to do something wrong, or that maybe they shouldn't be wearing that thing and they're not sure, or shouldn't be buying that thing, or whatever it is. But the biggest thing is that you can respectfully partake in someone else's culture by being invited, by following your host's lead, and respecting their boundaries. And this really goes to all kind of areas of interacting with folks who are from a community that is different than yours. And representations really matter in this whole process. And the misrepresentations of Native people are an outgrowth of settler colonialism. They are a way to dehumanize Native people, to minimize our connections to our cultural markers, to our cultural practices, to try and remove the power over them. And through that process, that is a continuation of this settler colonialism. So representations matter not just for Indigenous folks in terms of seeing misrepresentations as harmful to our self-esteem, our self-worth. There's actual research that backs this up. But also, as you can see at the bottom of this slide, this graph comes from a scholar named Stephanie Freiberg, who is Tulalip, who did the first study on the impacts of Indian mascots on Native youth and white youth. And as you can see on the top of the slide, when Native youth were shown images of Pocahontas, Disney's Pocahontas, Chief Wahoo read a list of negative stereotypes, their self-esteem went markedly down. And when white students were shown the same, their self-esteem actually went up. So white students are made to feel better about themselves at the subjugation of another community. And that is incredibly harmful, as well as the fact that they lower the self-esteem of Native youth. And this is something that these misrepresentations were something I spent 10 years calling out, writing 5 blog posts a week. These are just screenshots from some of my various blog posts, like constantly trying to say, hey, this imagery is not okay. Hey, these Halloween costumes are really problematic and really racist. Hey, Johnny Depp, your Tonto costume is a problem and is also super racist. J.K. Rowling, like Sephora, all of these companies trying to challenge them to see the ways that they are misrepresenting. There are are culturally appropriating, and that has a very intense negative impact on Native communities and our attempts to revitalize, maintain power over our cultural markers. But there have been some major gains in the last 10 years. And I'm going to end the sort of presentation with some examples of amazing things that are happening. So just in like 2020 alone, there was so much. There was the Washington football team changing their horribly racist name. Land O'Lakes Butter removed their really stereotypical Indian maiden from their logo. The ski resort that has a name that I consider to be a total slur against Native women, so I don't even like to say it, down at the bottom of the slide, they changed the name of their resort. And what I appreciated about them changing it is they said why. So there is a statement there of the ways that they engaged with the local tribe, the ways that they thought about it, and the reasons why they made the change. There's also all of the Columbus statues that are falling and have fallen all over the US as a symbol of recognizing the harm that Columbus represents and the genocide that he brought, and not that he is a celebrated figure in our history. Spirit Halloween, which is the largest retailer of Halloween costumes in what's currently known as the US, stopped selling Indian costumes, which was a huge win. And then places, even like big companies like Pinterest, invited me to write a piece about avoiding cultural appropriation on Halloween that was shared anytime anyone searched Indian Halloween costume or Native American Halloween costume. That was the pin that popped up when people search. So in addition to some of the reclaiming of storytelling and moving into media spaces that Native folks are doing, there have been some big movements on these issues of cultural appropriation, of misrepresentation, which is really positive to see. And Sterling Harjo, who is the creator of FX's Reservation Dogs, he said in an interview on our podcast, if you want to tell a story about a place and its people, why not let those people tell it? And so I wanted to offer these points as kind of a self-assessment for folks who are wanting to incorporate Native stories or Native histories or whatever it is into their own creative work. So we talked about creating a land acknowledgement and the self-assessment that sort of goes into that. But what about folks who are now thinking, okay, well, I want to help with the representation of Native peoples. I want to tell Native stories. I want to do that creative work. And so the questions are like, why this community? Why this question? Why this medium? And who is it serving? And what's the outcome from this work that I hope for? And does it have to be just me? And I think that is kind of the key question, is who can you involve with you to tell this story? How can you bring the actual people in who you're hoping to represent and give opportunities for Native folks to be in the room? So if the outcome is not positive change, justice, freedom, or sovereignty, then I would say don't do it. It's easy to say you want to, quote, like give voice to specific challenges or issues, but communities already have voices, and it's important to remember that. So it's important to examine your own positionality and your own set of privileges. So what, instead of saying I'm the perfect one to tell the story, thinking about what resources do you have to offer? What connections do you have? How can you increase the pipeline of Native talent into the spaces that you have access to? Because there is so much power in Native people being able to create our own stories. Because what this does is it counters the dehumanization that comes with settler colonialism. Because the only way that the settler nation of the United States could justify the dramatic loss of land and life toward Indigenous people, the brazen attempts to eradicate Native people, was by painting us as less than human, as saying that we were unworthy of that land, that we were unworthy of life, that we were uncivilized, that we were savage. All of these messages made it okay to take Native land, to move Native people to enact all of these horrible policies against Native folks because of the groundwork laid by media, by representations, by political cartoons, everything through time. So creating our own stories is the counter to that. It's our way of countering that dehumanization, of reclaiming the narratives and showing folks what Native people are really like. Because for so long, we have only had access to Hollywood Indians and Lone Ranger and Ponto and all of these things that don't represent the vibrancy and the diversity of the 572, federally recognized tribes, each with their own history, culture, language, etc. Hundreds more state recognized tribes, hundreds more non-recognized tribes. And the vast diversity of that is rarely represented in mainstream media. But of course, we're in a moment where things are changing and changing so beautifully for the better. We had Peacock TV's Rutherford Falls, which had a Native woman as the lead, and she got to have a love story, and she was educated and had a museum studies degree, and like all of these things like I never thought I would see on TV. We of course have Reservation Dogs, which completely changed everything. There's also kids programming like Molly of Denali, which is on PBS. There's Spirit Rangers, which is on Netflix. Just lots of different options there. And then Cherokee Nation has our own TV show called OCO TV, Voices of the Cherokee People. There's also Ava DuVernay is in development of a new drama called Sovereign, or Sovereignty or Sovereign, that is going to be coming out. So just beautiful examples of the power of Native people telling our own stories. There's also things like Indigenous Fashion Week Toronto, which showcased Native designers, reclaiming that space. Native literature everywhere, so many amazing Native books that can be read now. And mainstream publishers are publishing Native literature on a regular basis. We're seeing Native folks on the cover of fashion magazines, accepting awards, walking red carpets, like all of these things that we have not seen before. The little ones who are now able to dress up as characters from Reservation Dogs for Halloween versus having to see fake Indian costumes and things like that. And my podcast was another place where we've been really trying to tell these Native stories in true and beautiful ways. And kind of capture the complexity. This is my book, which also I try to be a part of this process as well of telling the stories of Native folks that we don't really know about, sharing the diversity and everything there. And then the last thing is I want us to think about Indigenous futures and futurism as well, and that Native folks will exist in the future. And so what are the ways that representations of that future can help us to start to do some imagining of what will it look like after we have land back? What will it look like when we can combine Native knowledges with Western technology and create our own new Indigenous future? So I will end with the question again, asking ourselves, how can we behave as good relatives to the land we occupy? And then I want to bring in this final little short story, and then maybe we'll have time for a question or two. But this brings us back to the story of Waterbug that I said at the beginning. This piece of art comes from an Anishinaabe artist named Chief Ladybird, and her tribe, her Anishinaabe people, has a similar story to Waterbug, but in their story, Waterbug is muskrat. So she says, I'm thinking about muskrat in relation to why we are building the foundations for a future that enables our culture and the land to thrive. Every time we learn a word from our language, that's that's our little muskrat paw putting another chunk of mud onto the turtle's back. Every time we unlearn toxic behavior, that's another chunk of mud on the turtle's back. Every time we resolve our trauma, resist colonial effery, and fight against systemic and environmental racism, that's another chunk of mud on the turtle's back. We are the muskrat. How are you adding mud to the turtle's back? So here are the ways to stay in touch. If you would like to learn more about my work or engage in some of these ideas. And with that, I would love to maybe answer a question or two in the last couple of minutes that we have. So
Thank
Woodell,
you.
thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Doctor. Lots of insights there, lots of takeaways for certain. I do have a couple questions queued up here. Well, I know you touched a little bit on it, but can you share a little bit as to how you see the future of Indigenous folks and Native American representation and advocacy evolving? And I guess on top of that too, any sort of changes that you personally would like to see within the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, it's been amazing to reflect on the kind of past decade of me writing about these misrepresentations and cultural appropriation and where we were just a decade ago to where we are today. So I have been so amazed and happy. Like, we're in a moment where like we have a Scorsese film in theaters that has a Native woman as the leading character, like it's and it's telling a really painful and dark history. I'm talking about Killers of the Flower Moon for folks who haven't seen, that was completely pushed away and unacknowledged for generations. So the fact that that is on big screens right now and like Lily Gladstone's in conversation for an Oscar, like it's just amazing to me. So and that film deeply engaged with relationships with the Osage people. It had Osage advisors, it had Osage language instructors, it had Osage actors. The chief of the Osage Nation was involved. Like, they made sure that Osage people were comfortable with the ways they were being represented in film. And that is the key, is those relationships. So that's what I'm so happy to see. And that's what I really want to see more of. But I also want to see stories that we've never seen. Like, I want to see a dramedy about a nerdy Native kid at a high school, like I want to see love stories. I want to see a rom-com, like all of these things that we haven't seen of Native folks. We're just at the tip of the iceberg of the possibilities that are out there.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I guess I have a follow-up question to that on the flip side, because I feel this inevitably happens, but any sort of recommendations for literature, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, obviously podcast, shout out to your podcast as well too, right? But any other forms of media that people might be able to look into to either learn more or from just strictly like an educational component, maybe just some of your favorites if we wanted to start there.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for another hour about all of the amazing things that folks can engage with, but an amazing resource if people are interested in children's literature specifically. So I think it's so important to educate our young ones, our little ones as well. So for children's literature, there's a website called American Indians in Children's Literature, and it is run by Debbie Reese, Dr. Debbie Reese, who's a Nambe Pueblo scholar, and it is just an incredible resource of like every book under the sun. She writes reviews, she recommends books, everything like that. And then in terms of like grown-up books, I mean, we could go in any genre of things, but right now I am loving the sort of like horror like fiction-ish, which is something that I never really liked before, but there's a new anthology called Never Whistle at Night that just came out that's all like Native horror and sort of scary stories, which is cool. Lots of amazing fiction that has come out. I just finished Calling for a Blanket Dance by Oscar Hoke, I think is his last name, which was great because it's Oklahoma natives. Oh my God, I'm like, my mind is spinning of how many there are. But really, if you search online for like Native literature or Native nonfiction or Indigenous literature, Indigenous nonfiction, there is a lot that is coming out. And one of the ways that you can determine if it actually is written by a Native person is if it has a tribal affiliation with a tribal name in the bio or the description. That's usually a good sign that this is written by a Native person. So that's a good place to start.
Great takeaways, great insights there. I know you and I were chatting a little bit before this event today, talking about me getting into comic books a little bit older or later in life, if you will. And yeah, I'm a big fan of the kind of that horror genre. I'd love to see more in that space as well there. Dr. Keene, thank you so much for taking your time out of your day to join us here. Thank you all as well for taking time out of your day to join us here at DreamBank. So as we wrap up here, I just wanted to go ahead and shout out that this is being recorded. So this will be aired on our YouTube page after the fact, and that at DreamBank we truly believe in the transformative power of dreams and celebrate our community that is made up of fellow fearless dreamers. And before we go ahead and cut out here, Dr. Keene, would just like one last question or one piece of insight or advice that you have for someone who is actively pursuing a dream right now.
Oh, that's a great question. I think it can be, especially when the world is such a mess, and there are so many things happening, it can be hard to imagine that there's a different future, but imagining and working in that space of imagination is a huge part of building that dream, of building that future. So I think a lot about the fact that we have to be able to see that future we're building towards in order to build towards it. So whether that's reading fiction, whether that is engaging in more of these sort of storytelling spaces, that's all working towards building that future that you hope to inhabit.
What a wonderful way to end. Dr. Keene, thank you so much. We will go ahead and cap it there, and we will see you all next time. Take care.
Widow.